The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Criminal trials are about coming to justice, often in very complicated circumstances. They're a two-dimensional resolution of multidimensional situations. They reduce crime, accusations of crime, loss, pain, fear, vengeance, penance, compensation, restitution, correction, and sometimes mercy to yes or no questions, guilty or not guilty. In the United States, they do their jobs through an adversarial system to resolve things one way or another. Trials are rarely about the whole story, the why. From A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Mass Shooting by Dr. William H. Reid, M.D. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. So we have reached the final episode of my trilogy on A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Mass Shooting by Dr. William Reid, episode 133, Accentuate. Dr. Lynn Fenton, James Holmes' therapist during grad school before the shooting, wrote the book Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer, and it has also been a terrific resource for this series. Now, please listen to episode 130 and 132 before this one, which explains so much background, analysis, updates, and the psychology regarding this horrendous crime. Now, we left off after the arrest of James Holmes, and we're beginning to deal with the fallout that resulted in the deaths of 12 people, with 58 others injured, some permanently disabled. In these first months after the arrest, Holmes was a model prisoner, cooperative and withdrawn. His parents wrote and visited when important court dates came up, and he appreciated the letters, though Holmes at first became tearful thinking about them. But this passed. However, his friends, Tim, Ben, Gargi, did not reach out. He deluded himself that they were not angry at him and that they still supported him despite his situation. Then came November. On video surveillance, Holmes is seen standing with his arms crossed before suddenly dropping backward, hitting the floor. He was sent to behavior control, BC, a safe place in jail where he was placed on suicide watch. BC was lined with hard rubber, with no furniture, and just a drain in the middle of the floor, which served as a toilet. Here, he became severely psychotic. Sitting naked on the floor, he told the staff that others were listening to his thoughts. He stared blankly at a wall and then rammed his head into it and then shoved food down the drain. He performed somersaults, attempting to balance a cup on his penis, and defecated on the floor. When a nurse tried to examine him, he resisted. His eyes were bloodshot and tearful as he slipped into catatonia, holding strange positions for long periods of time. Taken to the Denver Health Medical Center, this was the shortest emergency room visit in the history of humanity. He was back in BC in 2 hours after he'd had IV fluids, a CAT scan, and blood tests. Back in the room in 2 hours. Lying motionless on the floor, mumbling incoherently and crying, mucus dripped from his nose all the way to the floor. His lawyers arrived to discuss a court hearing getting no response from him. And then he slammed his head into the cell wall again, yelling, quote, "I see shadows," end quote. It took 9 staff members to strap him into a restraint chair. Severely dehydrated, he received 3 liters of fluids and medication to calm him down. Hours later, he could communicate, but still refused to eat. Corrections psychiatrist Dr. Moser monitored him on video camera and then transferred him to the Colorado Mental Health Institute's secure wing under an assumed name, where they began starvation protocols. Seriously ill, Holmes suffered from acute delirium, severe dehydration, and starvation, which had caused a serious imbalance in electrolytes. Dr. Raquel Davis also noted psychosis and catatonia, both associated with schizophrenia. Treated, his agitation lessened, and he began to sleep, slowly regaining some grasp on reality, although he remained suspicious of food. 5 days later, he returned to jail on antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medications. He showed significant improvement, eating well, and even chatting with correctional officers. He would explain that he rammed his head into the wall to get the bad thoughts out. However, he still had not spoken with a psychiatric clinician. December 28th, Holmes was depressed and suicidal, causing issues for the jail, which focuses on keeping inmates alive, unless, of course, you're Jeffrey Epstein. Placed in solitary confinement without clothes or possessions, his behavior would improve, and he began eating and drinking regularly with no signs of psychosis. Dr. Moser visited him daily, and he was returned to his regular cell 10 days later. January 2013, Tamara Brady and Daniel King from the Colorado State Public Defender's Office were assigned to the case with 166 criminal charges. These included 24 counts of murder, one set of 12 with deliberation, and the other set of 12 with extreme indifference, along with 142 other counts with sentence enhancement for violent crimes. The prosecution was led by Attorney General George Brashler and his team, while Judge Carlos A. Samore Jr. presided over the case. Dodging the press, wearing her bulletproof vest, Dr. Lynn Fenton was escorted into the courthouse by a team of sheriffs, moving rapidly in case, quote, someone wanted to take her out, end quote. And then she was in court, facing Holmes, 6 months since the shooting. The teams of lawyers were now fighting over whether Dr. Fenton still had a patient-doctor relationship with Holmes. If she did, her sessions with him and his notebook were privileged and inadmissible at trial. Defense attorney Tamara Brady, who was also absolutely hated by the public and experiencing harassment herself, was very effective, and the judge ruled that the notebook was protected by patient-doctor confidentiality. It was out. March 2013. The defense offered the prosecution a plea agreement, hoping to remove the death penalty from the table, but they declined. DA George Brashler rejected the plea, asserting that, quote, if anyone deserved the death penalty, it was Holmes, end quote. On April 1st, they announced that they were seeking the death penalty. And on May 13th, 2013, James Egan Holmes pled not guilty by reason of insanity. So we hear all the time that defendants are presumed innocent, but they are also presumed sane. Thus, the defense had no option but to argue that Holmes's bizarre behavior indicated he was insane when he committed these crimes. An element of the crime, intent, now comes into play, requiring the prosecution to prove it. The insanity defense hinges on whether a defendant had a serious mental disease or defect at the time of the offense, which must be shown to have affected their ability to intend to commit the crime. If a defendant did not intend to commit the crime, then there is no criminal guilt. There is no specific mental disorder that guarantees you a ruling of criminal insanity. Now, in Colorado, if a defendant had a mental disease during the act, it must be proven that they could not distinguish right from wrong. So hiding or covering up the crime, lying about your whereabouts, that indicates knowledge that the act was wrong. And Holmes did none of these. In felony cases, invoking not guilty by reason of insanity occurs in less than 1% of cases, and then it only succeeds 25% of the time. And in 70% of these, the prosecution and defense have already agreed that the insanity plea is appropriate before the trial even took place. In the 1960s, in addition to the McNaughton rule, which determines whether the defendant knew right from wrong, it also provided that a defendant would not be held criminally responsible if, when committing the crime, the behavior was, quote, result of a mental disease or defect, and he lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct, end quote. But then came 1981. John Hinckley attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan, and 3 years later, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The outcry from the public led to the passage of the Insanity Defense Reform Act, which tightened up the requirements for proving that a defendant had a severe mental disease or defect and was unable to appreciate the nature and quality of the wrongfulness of his acts. As of 2025, 4 states do not permit the insanity defense at all. These are Idaho, Kansas, Montana, and Utah. Now, the most significant post-Hinckley change was the adoption of guilty but mentally ill laws. So if you are guilty but mentally ill, you are still legally guilty, but instead of prison, a defendant is sent to an institution receiving mental health treatment. If his symptoms abate, he is required to serve the remainder of his sentence in a correctional facility. Someone acquitted by reason of insanity is also institutionalized and treated. And if it is deemed you are no longer a danger to himself or others, then you can be released into society. John Hinckley was released back into society in June 2022. So, using the insanity defense is not popular because it requires the defendant to admit to the crime, which is of great benefit to the prosecution. At this time in Colorado, if insanity is in question, the prosecution needed to prove the defendant sane beyond a reasonable doubt, unlike most states, where the defense must prove insanity based on a, quote, clear and convincing evidence standard, end quote. Critical fact, the insanity defense also means the defendant loses all confidentiality regarding their mental condition, and all related records become public. This meant that the notebook was back in. Immediately, Judge Samore ordered an insanity evaluation, and the defense hired Dr. Raquel Gurr, an esteemed psychiatrist with experience in schizophrenia. Reviewing all the documentation, Gurr met with Holmes weeks after his arrest and while he was now on medication. Gurr observed a man expressing little emotion, giving brief responses with no embellishments. Holmes struggled with straightforward questions, and she believed that his mind was defending him from bad memories, shielding him so that he could only formulate safe answers. Dr. Gurr pressed him about emotionally charged topics, and this protective demeanor shattered. He became visibly emotional, shaking, panting, and unable to talk. Now, this is the only notable outburst reported by his evaluators. Holmes feared people. He felt a powerful force was controlling him. He had wanted Dr. Fenton to stop the violent thoughts, but this violent part of his mind overruled him. He had no future, quote, "It had to be done. I was called to action," end quote. Dr. Gurr concluded that Holmes was suffering from schizophrenia, which was in evidence and increasing well before the shooting when he was acutely psychotic, meaning Gurr believes he was legally insane at the time of the shooting. Also for the defense, Dr. Robert Hanlon, a Chicago neuropsychologist, evaluated Holmes in 2013 and again in 2015 to assess potential malingering. He found no evidence of faking or exaggerating symptoms. Holmes had a superior IQ, above average memory, and normal executive functions, including information processing and motor coordination. His social cognition, such as recognizing facial expressions and speech patterns, was also normal. The prosecution hired Dr. Philip Resnick, a respected forensic psychiatrist from Cleveland, and Dr. Chris Mohandy, a California forensic psychologist and a violence expert. And the defense denied them access to Holmes. So instead, Resnick and Mohandy reviewed documents, videos, evidence, and interviewed Holmes's professors, family, and friends. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit also created a profile of Holmes in absentia, one Dr. Reid thought omitted several relevant facts about Holmes. So he wasn't impressed with the BAU's profile. Okay, and we're not done with experts. Judge Samore appointed his own expert to evaluate Holmes, rather than relying on experts from either side. Dr. Jeffrey Metzner, a Denver psychiatrist with extensive clinical and forensic credentials, assessed Holmes' competence to stand trial, his criminal responsibility, and potential mitigation for the death penalty. He presented his findings to the judge, who then shared them with both the defense and prosecution. Dr. Metzner had transferred Holmes to the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo for evaluation in a secure clinical setting. He spent 25 hours interviewing Holmes. Additional neuropsychological testing was ordered. Holmes's statements were disjointed, and he stated that the responsibility for the shooting belonged to his crazy self, suggesting he was trying to understand his fractured mind rather than making excuses for the behavior. However, his statements to Metzner and Gurr were inconsistent and contrary. Holmes told Gurr he chose the movie theater because he liked movies. Now we know he selected the theater strategically to maximize the casualties. He told Metzner that his gun jammed after 15 shots, even though 65 cartridge casings were collected from the theater floor. One thing that he admitted was that his theory on human capital, that killing others would improve his feeling and add value to his life, had failed. However, he still believed in it after months on antipsychotic medication. Evaluators consistently noted his flat affect and lack of empathy regarding the murders, the victims, and their families. He was aware of his surroundings and deflected a lot, avoiding topics that could cause discomfort. Dr. Metzner recognized his human capital theory was delusional. He assessed Holmes as psychotic before, during, and after the shooting, but found him capable of criminal intent and thus legally sane. Holmes could distinguish right from wrong, and his mental illness did not prevent him from being culpable. And in the end, neither the defense nor the prosecution liked Metzner's report, and they both sought a new expert, another one, to address criminal responsibility. And thus enters Dr. William H. Reid, our author. Judge Samore was acting to ensure that Holmes received a fair trial, and the defense and prosecution, along with Colorado and federal law enforcement, cooperated fully with Dr. Reid, providing him with the necessary records. After weeks of studying the case files, Reid began interviewing numerous people and visiting various sites. Public defender Dan King introduced Dr. Reid to James Holmes, who was then escorted out of his cell so Reid could examine the pictures on his cell walls. Again at the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo, in the secure wing, Holmes had his own nursing staff and access to a day room and TV. And despite objections from the defense, Reid insisted on video recording his interviews with Holmes, which would prove incredibly helpful. With only security present, Reid sat beside an unshackled Holmes to begin the first of 6 lengthy interviews. 2 years after the shooting and 18 months on antipsychotic medication, Holmes was neatly dressed and freshly showered, with tousled hair and a trim beard. His eyes were not bulging, and he seemed neither aloof nor arrogant, but somewhat reserved. He spoke slowly, often pausing, and his responses were brief. His emotional expression was limited. He smiled occasionally, but rarely showed anger, tears, or deep laughter. To break the ice, Reid offered him a cup of juice, receiving a slight grin. Over several days, Dr. Reid repeated the same topics, getting consistent but not identical responses compared to what Holmes had told the other doctors. Holmes's mental status, used to assess his condition during these interviews, was mostly normal, though some of his behaviors were odd. When discussing depression or suicidal thoughts, his facial expression remained unchanged. Nurses told Reid that Holmes sometimes initiated conversations with female staff, although these interactions were described as creepy. You think? Okay, thought blocking. This occurs when the unconscious mind fears expressing uncomfortable or painful thoughts, resulting in slow and awkward conversation that lacks any depth. Genuine emotions were far too risky for Holmes to express. He showed no signs of depression, he concentrated well, and did not feel worthless or guilty, all indicating a high emotional guardedness. Aware that he was being recorded, that his words could be used against him in court, Holmes felt a mild paranoia, which sounds very reasonable to me in this case. His logic was sound, his thinking was organized, although again, some was a little abnormal. There is no evidence of hallucinations, but he did mention mysterious shadows, though they were not present at this time. Reid asked Holmes what he thought about human capital, if he thought killing people would increase his worth. Holmes agreed, but this suggests he might kill again should he have the chance, and the jury was not privy to this information. It would be totally too inflammatory. As Holmes expected he'd be killed or arrested, he kept his practice shooting a secret to avoid interference. So yeah, he had gone practice shooting. When discussing his violent thoughts with Gargi, Dr. Fenton, and Dr. Feinstein, he omitted, knowing that these thoughts were wrong. He, quote, played hide and seek with counselors Roth and Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, end quote. He rejected commitment to a psych ward as it would interfere with his mission. In planning the shooting, he meticulously planned distractions and escape routes, extensively booby-trapping his apartment, while his road stars would deter the police in case of a vehicle chase. Aiming to maximize casualties and minimize interruptions, he equipped himself with multiple weapons, body armor, mask, and earbuds. His actions were deliberate, including a fake phone call to avoid arousing suspicion by any in the theater that night. Diagnosis: schizotypal personality disorder, which is a lifelong condition marked by social and interpersonal deficits, discomfort in relationships, and distortions in thinking and perception. Symptoms usually appear in early adulthood, although they can emerge during childhood and adolescence. While generally stable, exceptional stressors can worsen symptoms and lead to acute psychosis. Dr. Reid concluded that at the time of the shooting, James Holmes did not meet the criteria for schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. Dr. Reid said that despite other psychologists' disagreements, the symptoms in his history did not align with those diagnoses. He was seriously mentally ill, but this did not prevent him from forming criminal intent. Was Holmes suicidal? He claims he wasn't and had no plans to end his life. The scratching of his wrist with cardboard as a kid, this was not a suicide attempt. Did he have clinical depression? No. He occasionally felt down, but he did not suffer from severe mood swings or prolonged clinical depression. Dr. Reid's evaluation aligns with Dr. Metzner's findings. Legally, Holmes was capable of forming a culpable mental state, and despite any mental issues, he understood the potential consequences for himself and others, and he was aware of the moral wrongness of his actions separate from their legal implications. Addressing the questions the court asked Dr. Reid to examine, Holmes's human capital concept had begun in grad school, his own concoction. Moral, right, and wrong were viewed as individual choices, and he knew society would see the shootings as illegal and morally wrong. Holmes's statements and his notebook offer insight into his mind prior to the shooting, making them relevant to his insanity defense. There is no evidence that Holmes thought his plan was crazy or psychotic. The part of himself that wanted to kill was stronger than the part that was ambivalent, and he hoped the dangerous part of himself could be controlled. However, there's no indication that he suffered from dissociative identity disorder, also known as split personality. If Holmes's motivation was hatred, revenge, or anger, the defense's case of insanity would dissolve. And there is no indication that Holmes acted from hatred or angst as a significant motivator. He equated his hatred of mankind as being similar to hating broccoli. Quote, "For most people, most of the time, even severe mental disorders do not interrupt voluntary adherence to the law. I didn't see an exception in this case. Although the chain of events that led to the shooting was no doubt affected by his psychiatric symptoms, there was little or no reasonable psychiatric evidence that Holmes's symptoms kept him from being able to form the requisite culpable mental state. That is, knowing and appreciating legal, social, and moral aspects of his acts." End quote. Jury selection started on January 20th, 2015, with 9,000 individuals summoned. 9,000. After 3 months, 12 jurors and 12 alternates were chosen. Jurors were instructed to not discuss the case, not even among themselves, and to avoid all contact with media outlets. Any violations had to be reported, and 5 jurors would not finish the trial. Judge Zamore permitted one video feed of the trial to be utilized by all media outlets, with neither the jury nor the gallery visible. Media representatives were also barred from other areas of the courthouse. The second floor was converted into a mental health center for victims and their families, with counselors available and a service dog for comfort. I think that is absolutely magnificent. Bob and Arlene Holmes were present in court every day, often joined by their daughter, Chris. The defendant wore suits, not the orange prison garb. Though not visibly shackled, the judge ordered hidden restraints due to the violent nature of the charges. The defense position. The defendant admitted to the shooting, but they claimed his schizophrenia hindered his ability to control his actions. The prosecution's position. Holmes did it, he was sane at the time, and they sought the death penalty. The first 5 days of testimony were from survivors and first responders, followed by 15 days of testimony from investigators, law enforcement, and other victims. Nearly 200 witnesses testified, some sharing personal experiences, while expert witnesses provided professional opinions. District Attorney Brashler called Dr. Reid as his first psychiatric expert. He also concluded that Holmes did not have antisocial personality disorder, he was not a psychopath, and he had no history of violence. His testimony largely supported the prosecution's case, asserting that Holmes did not meet Colorado's legal criteria for insanity, and Dr. Reid also made clear that he was not an advocate for the prosecution. The prosecution used the notebook to illustrate Holmes's careful planning. Now, in Colorado, jurors can question witnesses, which I've said I absolutely love, and it helped to clarify Dr. Reid's statements. So remember, we first ran into this, jurors asking questions of the witnesses in 16 minutes during the William Wise trial in Indiana. Fun fact, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Iowa, Kentucky, Nevada, and North Carolina also permit jurors to ask questions during the trial. Okay, so Dr. Metzner followed, offering similar expert opinions. Both Dr. Woodstock and Gurr would testify that Holmes did not understand his actions or their wrongfulness. Ex-girlfriend Gargi testified about their superficial relationship and the breakup. The prosecution implied that his anger over the breakup was a catalyst for the shooting, though there's very little evidence of this. And Gargi revealed that on March 25, 2012, he told her that he didn't want to get caught or go to prison. Further, his Match.com profile asked, quote, "Will you visit me in prison?" End quote. This being evidence that he knew what he was planning to do was wrong. At this point, Dr. Reid observes that the defense was probably just trying to keep Holmes alive with the death penalty pending. But then came the breach. Juror 673 notified the judge of a possible breach involving 3 jurors. Juror 872 had her husband on speakerphone talking about a case-related Facebook post and a tweet from an attorney. 2 other jurors had overheard the husband saying, quote, "The idiot, the judge was mad. I hope the jury saw the video," end quote. These 3 jurors were dismissed, and juror 673 was praised for her fortitude and honesty. And, oh boy, 2 additional jurors were dismissed. One had failed to reveal that a relative had been shot in a robbery, and another failed to inform the judge about personally knowing a witness in the case. So ultimately, 19 jurors remained, with 12 responsible for deliberating Holmes's fate. May 2015, about 5 weeks into the trial, Dr. Lynn Fenton's testimony was looming. Over the previous 3 years, she had painstakingly tried to regain some foundation after the earth had dropped away from beneath her. Months after Holmes' arrest, she finally began to see clients again. But with the publicity about to spike, she believed it was necessary to inform her current patients of her involvement with the shooting, hoping to maintain their trust. In a group therapy session, a young woman had lost her best friend in the theater shooting that night. And during this next session, Dr. Fenton explained to her clients who she was and her role, bracing for a reaction. The young woman cried out, shaken, shouting, quote, "Murderer! I hate you! I hate you! You killed my best friend!" End quote. The accusation hit Lynn hard as the other group members intervened, giving the young woman support. Giving her time, the young woman, her voice a whisper, would come to Lynn and say, quote, "I'm so sorry. I know you didn't really kill her. I'm just so angry," end quote. Accepting, Dr. Fenton told her she was brave and that she understood, and quote, "We are all so angry. None deserved to experience Holmes," end quote. Sworn in, Dr. Lynn Fenton testified that in March 2012, Holmes had said he had homicidal thoughts 2 to 3 times daily, but refused to share details, had no specific targets, no plans, and never mentioned weapon purchases. He showed no signs of depression, mania, or auditory hallucinations associated with schizophrenia. She and Dr. Feinstein considered hospitalization, but their hands were tied when he refused. With no imminent danger, they had no legal grounds. Feinstein testified also, supporting Dr. Fenton's observations. They had offered Holmes antipsychotic medication, which he declined, and then he ended therapy. She had remained concerned, notifying the Beta team, which ran a background check and produced no red flags. She called his professors and a parent, who said he had always been socially anxious. Quote, "If Holmes had always been odd, it made it less likely that he was having some sort of psychotic break," end quote. And the prosecution then rested its case after hearing more survivor testimonies. Dr. Fenton felt, quote, "shattered, angry, and betrayed. My life had become unrecognizable. It was one thing to know a killer or to study a killer's history and be able to connect the dots, or not in Holmes's case. It is quite another to have multiple hidden enemies forever, to know that even when the trial ends, there would never be closure for me. Whether Holmes lived or died didn't take the target off my back. My safety would always be compromised. I'd always have to look over my shoulder and keep up my walls, park beneath a streetlight, be hyper-vigilant about my surroundings, and stay off social media," end quote. The impacts on others that I hadn't considered before reading her book. Lynn Fenton would basically withdraw from society. She moved out to a cabin in the woods, and to this day, she conducts her sessions with clients virtually. To this day. The defense played videos of James Holmes falling backward, plus others of his bizarre behavior, followed by details of his treatment at the Denver Health Medical Center. Dr. Woodcock testified that Holmes's behavior following the shooting indicated Holmes was psychotic and legally insane. His psychosis was marked by delusional thinking, although he was well-oriented and able to communicate somewhat effectively. And a battle commenced. The prosecution was aggressive in their cross-examination, with the defense vigorously objecting. Dr. Woodcock would admit that he reviewed the Holmes files 2 years after the shooting in the summer of 2014, and that his testimony was based on that one 2012 interview with Holmes. Brashler got him to acknowledge that he did not observe signs of catatonia and that Holmes had not spoken of any hallucinations. Dr. Raquel Gurr testified that Holmes was not angry or vengeful, but rather consumed by delusions. He expressed this to Gargi and to Dr. Fenton, that he felt compelled to act, describing it, quote, "like a storm," end quote, and noted his struggles to find effective help. To cope, Holmes distracted himself with video games and by plucking out his hair. Dr. Gurr compared Holmes to the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. highlighting how delusions can manifest more bizarrely in intelligent individuals. Holmes's MRI revealed that he had a slight but statistically significant lack of temporal lobe tissue, impacting personality and sensory processing. His right frontal orbital cortex, crucial for emotions and inhibiting inappropriate behavior, was smaller than 99% of the population. His amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, was smaller than 95% of normal individuals. Now, this information does shed some light on his behavior, and it positioned Dr. Gurr as the defense's star witness. Closing arguments began mid-July 2015, with both sides passionately discussing their opposing positions on Holmes's sanity. The judge then provided the jury with 66 pages of instruction, including 30 specific directives about the 166 counts, including the first-degree murder charges, which were now consolidated into 12. Now, punishment was not part of these deliberations, and after 2 anxious days, the foreperson informed the judge that the jury had reached a decision. They found James Egan Holmes guilty of first-degree murder.
Oh.
3 days later, the jury began hearing testimony on how Holmes would be punished for the murders. There's 3 phases. The first phase focused on aggravating factors, followed by jury deliberation. In the second phase, the jury examined mitigating factors and would deliberate again. If they did not unanimously agree that aggravating factors outweighed mitigating ones, the death penalty would not be authorized. If all 12 jurors found beyond a reasonable doubt that aggravating factors did outweigh mitigating ones, they would then hear arguments on the death penalty before making a final decision on Holmes's fate. So, phase 1 is pretty straightforward. What are the aggravating factors? Did he kill more than 2 people in the first degree, knowingly creating a grave risk to others and committing murder in a cruel manner? Did he lie in wait or intentionally kill a child? Agreeing with any of these, they would proceed with the death penalty phase 2. Assistant District Attorney Rich Orman's presentation was, quote, brief, brutal, and riveting, end quote. The photos of the crime scene and the names of the 12 victims, including 6-year-old Veronica Moser, who was shot 4 times, made the case compelling. And the jurors accepted 4 aggravating factors, but excluded the intentional killing of a child. The next phase began with the defense trying to humanize Holmes. Defense attorney Rebecca Higgs acknowledged that the defendant was legally sane, but also seriously mentally ill. His mental illness was not an excuse, but it was, quote, a reason to choose life. We don't kill people for being sick, end quote. 18 witnesses testified, including his sister Chris, who remembered him as a gentle and protective brother. Bob Holmes shared family photos showing happy moments together. Arlene Holmes stated, quote, I didn't realize that his loudest cry for help was his silence, end quote. Neighbors I mentioned in part 1, Martin and Catherine Barrett, described Holmes as happy, shy, and non-confrontational. And Dr. Mentzner described Holmes as incurable schizoaffective disorder. Now the jury need to weigh aggravating factors against the mitigating ones to decide if the death penalty was appropriate. If any juror found the aggravating factors did not outweigh the mitigating ones beyond a reasonable doubt, the case would shift to non-capital punishment sentencing by the judge. On August 3rd, the jury unanimously found aggravating factors in all 12 murder charges. The death penalty portion would proceed. Now they would deliberate as to whether to impose death or life in prison without parole for James Holmes. 12 victims testified, while the defense did not present any witnesses. Mary Teresa Hoover, A.J. Bach's mother, told the jury she had lost half of her children. Karen Tevis, mother of Alex Tevis, shared the pain she felt every day without her son. Sandy Phillips wore her daughter Jessica Gawi's scarf and expressed that she and her husband felt that they have no future anymore. John Larimer's sister, Beth Kraft, spoke about missing her brother. From a family of 5 children, Beth said that when her family was whole, they were always there for each other. Quote, "My innocent way of viewing the world is gone. The defendant may be mentally ill, but he is more evil than anything else." End quote. Her mother, Kathleen Larimer, added, quote, "I'm so tired of crying." End quote. Amy Garabi, whose son Yusuf survived after being shot in the head, spoke directly to Holmes's twisted human capital theory, where each stolen life added to his own value. Quote, "Despite what one self-absorbed, heartless killer tried to do, in the end, we won. In the end, we wound up with the most points. We have the most self-worth. Game over." End quote. Derek Sproul was at the movies with friends from Buckley Air Force Base and with his wife, Chi-Chi. Chi-Chi wasn't all that excited to see the Batman film, but went along anyway. When Derek heard loud bangs, like many of the others, he thought it was a prank. When his friend, Jesse Childress, suddenly collapsed, Derek yelled for everyone to get down. As the police arrived, Derek desperately tried to help Jesse, but was unable to lift him. And it wasn't until the end of the evening Derek would learn that Jesse had died. Derek lamented, quote, "I had to leave Jesse." And Chi-Chi would recall, "I just remember feeling terror," end quote. Truck driver Ian Sullivan wasn't at the theater that night. Grieving the loss of his little girl, the anguish over not being there to protect her was palatable. He said that he visited Veronica's grave each year and found a birthday card on the headstone from the man who was with Veronica when Sullivan couldn't be, the police officer who carried the dying girl out of the theater in his arms, Mike Hawkins. Ian knew Mike understood, and he shared photos and stories, like in May 2012, when Veronica caught her first fish, a trout, and gutted it herself. Ian told CBS News in 2015 that, quote, "It helps to understand that there's still someone there who actually cares," end quote. Now the judge addressed the jury one more time, noting, quote, "that this may well be the most important and serious decision you will ever be asked to make. The jury's Phase 2 findings has authorized the death penalty. These last deliberations would determine whether or not every juror believed execution was appropriate justice for Holmes. A unanimous death sentence for any of the counts would invoke the death penalty." End quote. In less than 24 hours, the jury reached a verdict. On August 7th, 2015, Judge Samore read to the court, quote, "We, the jury, do not have a unanimous final verdict on this count, and as a result, the court will impose a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole." End quote. Arlene Holmes broke down in tears, supported by her husband, Bob. The anguished grief and sobs of the victims and families could be heard in the corridor. This was followed by 2 days of victim impact statements, which included over 100 speakers. Arlene Holmes was the last to speak, noting that her son feels remorse, but cannot express it due to his illness. During formal sentencing, he received 12 consecutive life sentences without parole and an additional 3,318 years for 141 lesser offenses, marking the longest sentence in U.S. history. Judge Samore added, quote, "The defendant does not deserve any sympathy," end quote, contrasting sharply with the compassion of the jury. Bonnie Kate Porcio burst into tears when she learned the jury had spared Holmes's life. Her mother, Kathleen, gave her impact statement. Holmes's bullets had shattered Bonnie Kate's kneecap, causing her to have continued excruciating pain from damaged nerves, which the doctors warn will likely get worse. Quote, "When justice isn't served, there's a brutal message delivered to the victims. When punishment doesn't fit the crime, the message to the victims is that your loss, your pain, isn't important," end quote. And I can respect her sentiment because there's a lot of raw pain in there. The Aurora Police Department had been under gag order throughout the trial. With it over, Commander Mike Daly would say he still relives the horrors from that night every time he drives past the theater. Quote, "I still have images of hurt and wounded people leaving the theater. Hundreds more in the parking lot in shock. Members of our department suffer from a number of problems: depression, alcohol abuse. We have marital problems going on and mental and physical health problems, all attributed to this event. We are anticipating further and ongoing issues in our department, including the possibility of suicide by our own officers. I hope that prison is not kind to him. I hope prison gives him his just rewards," end quote. And I'm looking forward to hearing Commander Daly speaking at CrimeCon in Denver next week. Holmes was initially placed in the Colorado State Penitentiary, isolated from other inmates. In October 2015, he was assaulted after an incident with a gate opening. He later was transferred to the San Carlos Correctional Facility for inmates with severe mental illness. Now 37 years old, he is currently incarcerated at the high-security U.S. Penitentiary in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, about 165 miles north of Philadelphia. Dr. Reid felt it was important to highlight that Colorado made significant efforts to improve mental health resources in the 5 years after the Aurora shooting, such as opening more crisis centers, walk-in clinics, and establishing more hotlines. However, funding for non-crisis services is minimal. The question why remains challenging. Despite examining the shooter's background, the reasons for such actions are complex and elusive. The situation is rare, but mass shootings are likely to continue, and we should focus on understanding the data surrounding active shooters and mass murderers. The FBI published a study in 2013 analyzing active shootings in the U.S. from 2000 to 2013, which includes the Aurora theater shooting data. Notably, 67% of these incidents were over before police arrived, with 56% ended by the shooter. 40% of shooters committed suicide, while others simply stopped shooting or fled. Brave, unarmed civilians interceded, ending 13% of these incidents, with another 13% ended when armed civilians exchanged fire with the shooter. 1.3% involved off-duty police officers intervening, resulting in the shooter's death. 1.3% of these incidents had more than one shooter, and only 3.8% of shooters were female, and all of those incidents occurred on college campuses. Very few shooters used improvised explosive devices or body armor as Holmes did. Now, the FBI also followed up, producing a very ambitious Part 2 of this report, published in 2018. So listen to this. Quote, "The FBI's objective was to examine specific behaviors that may precede an attack and which might be useful in identifying, assessing, and managing those who might be on the pathway to deadly violence. End quote. So, of course, I read this, and unfortunately, many active shooters do not show many consistent warning signs, which is problematic for those trying to prevent mass shootings. But it still produced some good information. 77% spent over a week planning their attack. So there is time to take note of this. 46% took at least a week to gather the necessary means for the attack, and most obtained firearms legally. Regarding previous offenses, 35% have prior convictions for things like DUIs and theft, and 2/3 experienced or engaged in bullying, 11% having stalked someone. What this means, though, is that the vast majority have no violent criminal history, so there is no blipping on the radar. Motive. In cases where a primary grievance was identified, 49% of motives were linked to some kind of negative interpersonal relationship or an employer taking action against the shooter, which can be real or utter fantasy. This perceived grievance provides a sense of purpose or a mission for the attacks. Furthermore, in 64% of cases, at least one victim was specifically identified, while broader factors like ideology or hate only accounted for 7% of the cases. In the year before the attack, an active shooter often experiences, on average, 3.6 stressors. They typically display 4 to 5 concerning behaviors, noticeable to others, related to mental health, interpersonal issues, and or communicating violent intentions, all of which Holmes exhibited. Additionally, 21% showed concerning behavior with firearms. So someone with no history of being interested in firearms or wanting firearms suddenly goes out and buys a shotgun. Okay, that's a concerning behavior. So juveniles, so under the age of 18, were more likely to have concerning behaviors noticed by schoolmates and teachers than family members. For adults 18 or over, spouses or domestic partners were the primary observers. So what did people do when they saw concerning behaviors? 83% opted to speak directly with the person, and the rest did nothing. And notably, only 41% of these instances, these concerning behaviors, were reported to law enforcement. That means that recognizing concerning behavior does not necessarily mean it gets reported to the authorities. So please do not think, I noticed this, but I'm sure somebody reported it, because they don't, the vast majority of the time. I was also interested in the stressors, so your physical, psychological, or social forces that negatively impact a person, creating distress. So, a word of caution first. While stress correlates with criminal behavior, many people face problems without resorting to violence, crime, or any concerning behaviors at all. This is called normal life. The FBI identified 5 extreme stressors: mental health issues, financial strain, job-related problems, conflicts with family or peers, and marital issues. Nothing shocking there. Now, mental health as a stressor focuses on observable behaviors, such as struggling with depression, anxiety, or paranoia, rather than formal clinical mental health diagnoses. 48% had suicidal ideation, with several attempts occurring within the year before the shooting. It seems obvious, but seeking help for distressed, stressed people is crucial. Shooters are not always isolated loners. 51% were never married, 22% were separated or divorced, 68% were living with someone at the time of the incident, and the rest had a strong online presence. And in terms of a specific trigger for the violence, 44% experienced some kind of precipitating event, 14% did not, and 40-something percent, we just don't know. Threats. 55% of individuals made a threat against a target, with 95% of these occurring face-to-face. So my takeaway, if someone threatens to harm you at work next Tuesday, and you just wrote him up, and his wife just left him, stressing him out, take it seriously and report he's threatening you. Leakage. Now, this occurs when someone hints at their feelings or intentions to a third party, indicating a willingness to commit violence. Take it seriously. Indirect threats are more subtle, vague, possibly joking. Holmes both leaked and issued indirect threats. Now, his notebook exemplifies what we call a legacy token, a way for the offender to claim credit for their action and explain their motive, which Holmes sent to Dr. Fenton. About 30% of offenders do this. All right, the Active Shooter Incidents 2024 report, published in June 2025, so just a couple months ago, surprisingly states only 25% of active shooters had a diagnosable mental illness, which is about the same as the general population. And please remember, there is no direct causal link between mental illness and violence. One doesn't cause the other. But mental health remains a risk factor, quote, based on vulnerabilities that may be present, problematic behaviors, or impaired judgment, end quote. So from 2020 to 2025, active shooting incidents increased by 70% compared to 2015 to 2019. But from 2023 to 2025, these incidents decreased by 50%. We can only hope this trend continues as we go forth. So, the aftermath of the shooting. The 720 Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, was created to remember the victims, survivors, and their families. The foundation advocates for long-term needs of the survivors and supports other communities impacted by mass tragedy by providing advice and guidance. Located in the city of Aurora Municipal Center's Waterwise Reflection Garden is the memorial. Walking along a winding path, the reflecting stone seat is dedicated to the victims, and you'll come to a beautiful statue named Accentuate, which consists of 83 white cranes that converge from all sides and begin to rise upward, with the 13 uppermost cranes having translucent wings that glow in the sunlight, representing those who died. I'll also remember that Jonathan Blanc, John Larimar, Matt McQuinn, and Alex Tivis were all shot while using their bodies to shield others inside the Aurora Theater that night when this terrible evil was unleashed, and goodness and decency rose up, defending loved ones in a selfless act. The 13th anniversary of the shooting was just a month or so back, was on July 20th, 2025. Shooting survivor Dylan Boxer organized a blood drive through his company, Vitalant, which is one of the nation's largest nonprofits focused on blood and biotherapies. With the assistance of the 720 Memorial Foundation, a blood drive was held at the Century 16 Theater. Quote, "It is a chance to bring life back to where life was lost. It's very poetic to have a life-saving event in a place on a day remembered in infamy for loss of life and tragedy. Having it here just seems right," end quote. Dylan Boxer said, and I agree. And that concludes the story of A Dark Night in Aurora by Dr. William H. Reid. Tough one. Oh my God. Thank you for listening, and your support means a great deal to me. Never doubt it. And my amazing murder bookies on Patreon have helped select our next book, which is A Tangled Web, a cyberstalker, a deadly obsession, and a twisting path to justice by Leslie Rule, daughter of the renowned true crime author Anne Rule. So on a bleak and chilly November day in 2012, 37-year-old Carrie Farver vanished without a trace from her life in Omaha, Nebraska. Shocking everyone, she left her young son behind, igniting a firestorm of concern and speculation. But her mother, Nancy Rainey, steadfastly refused to accept that her daughter had simply walked away from everything she loved. So brace yourself for one of the most intricate and bewildering true crime stories I have ever encountered. Part 1, episode 135, will drop in 2 weeks. And I will see you at CrimeCon Denver. Don't forget our meetup. I will be at the Embers Lodge Bar Friday night at 9 p.m. Thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. I see you as you hear me. Share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or on X, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And you can join Patreon for $2 to $4 a month. Links are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, July 2025, with my sources, photographs, show notes, our recipes, and wine pairings. Trust your gut and lock your doors and windows. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.